Well, thanks very much, Wayne, for that great introduction. I also want to thank Molly and the Manitoba office for inviting me here tonight. I do apologize that Winnipeg's gotten snow. We haven't yet. Fingers crossed that lasts for as long as possible. We feel your pain in winter. So as Wayne put it, I'm going to talk today about public-private partnerships, or the P3 model, which is one way to build, operate, and maintain our public infrastructure. And I think P3s can be somewhat intimidating because, you know, anytime you sort of look for information on them, you're struck by all these arcane kind of concepts. There's discount rates, there's public sector comparators, there's risk transfer, there's value for money assessments. And so it can get, it can be kind of intimidating for the layperson. And I think part of that is on purpose, because I don't think they really want us to look under the hood of this model. Hopefully once we're done tonight, you'll be less intimidated and more angry, because I think at the end of the day, there's no doubt that this model does not work in the public interest. So I'd like to share my screen. Please tell me, Wayne, if this works, okay? Can people see that?
I can see it.
All good? Wonderful, 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 wonderful. So I just want to give like a little primer just to begin on what a P3 is, because, you know, not everyone knows what that is. It's best to look at how governments have traditionally built things like hospitals, schools, highways, and other public infrastructure in order to get a better understanding of how P3s actually diverge from that traditional model. So the traditional public build model is quite straightforward, right? It's what's known in the P3 parlance as design, bid, build, right? Which means that if you want to build a school, the government contracts an architectural firm or an engineering consultant to design the school according to the government's needs and specifications. The architect produces building plans. General contractors will then make bids upon to construct the school, right? And whoever wins the bid builds the school, right? The government maintains ownership throughout the process. It obviously maintains and continues to operate the school once it's built, and the government is the sole source of financing. So that's how we've traditionally built public infrastructure in Canada. Now, a public-private partnership differs from this traditional build model based on the degree of private sector involvement, right? So throughout the process, from design to construction to operation, the private sector has a much more prominent role. And a P3 usually involves the same private entity or consortium financing, constructing, or managing a project in return for a promised stream of payments, right? Whether that's from government or whether that's from user fees, right? And usually over a specified period of time. The most common sort of P3 in Canada is the design, build, finance, operate, maintain, or what is euphemistically called the DBOFOM, which means exactly that, right? Which the private contractor will design the building, they will build the building, they will contribute maybe not all, but some private financing, and then they will operate and maintain the building for a set period of time after its construction, usually for at least 30 years, right? After which the project is usually handed over to government. And we can sort of see in this illustration here that the major differences between the P3 model and the traditional build model is the private sector is responsible for a lot more in the P3 model, right? They not only design and build, but they also finance, they operate and maintain. So pretty straightforward, okay? So why is this model deemed so superior in certain respects to the traditional public build model? Well, you'll usually get three arguments from P3 advocates as to why this is a superior build model, right? Private financing means the private sector has skin in the game. Therefore, it'll seek out efficiencies, which will encourage on-time completion and on-budget completion. Otherwise, they'll get penalized, right? P3's allows the government to harness the private sector efficiencies, cost cutting, cost effectiveness, innovation, things like that, that Wayne talked about at the in the introduction. And finally, the granddaddy, which is P3's allow the government to transfer the risk of delays, cost overruns, design failures, et cetera, onto the private sector. And anyone that's entered into the P3 debate knows about the idea of risk transfer. It's ubiquitous in any P3 debate. And I'm going to explain these a little bit more later, but for the time being, these are sort of the standard rationale for why governments, arguments that governments give for why they want to pursue the P3 model. Now, a lot of people ask, well, is this privatization? Doesn't the government ultimately own these projects? Who cares if we let the private sector, you know, not only build, but also finance, operate, and maintain these projects if at the end of the day we own them? And so, yes, theoretically, the public owns these buildings, often at the end of the contract. But I really think the question we should ask when we are viewing P3s and how they operate is, are we as the public treated as the owners of these projects? Do we have control over how they function and operate as owners? And the answer to this question is no, at least not during the life of what are sometimes 30-year contracts. So a P3 school reference guide provided to the Saskatoon public school staff clearly states that employees should treat the P3 school as you would a leased space. And so much of how institutions operate are dictated by the terms of the P3 contract and not the public interest. Indeed, these purportedly public buildings often don't operate in the best interest of the teachers, the students, the healthcare workers, the patients, and the other publics who these institutions are supposed to serve. I'm sure you're all aware of the restrictions that are enforced in these contracts in regards to schools, what you're allowed to use the school for, when it can open, what extracurricular activities are allowed, what you can put on the walls, getting permission from the contractor to get a ball off the roof or to change a light bulb. To say these are public buildings when so much of their use is determined by the interests of a private entity seeking to protect the value of their assets is really to torture the definition of what the public is. So I would certainly consider P3s to be part of what political scientists call the privatization policy family. Now, it's usually the private finance part of the P3 model that comes in for the majority of criticism, as it guarantees that P3 projects will cost more to finance, given that governments can borrow at significantly lower rates of interest in the private sector. And certainly private financing is a concern, and I'll touch on that a little later. But what's less discussed, I think, in debates over P3s is the maintenance component of the P3 model. And this is curious because it's often the maintenance component of the contract, which is the primary concern for 30 plus years once these buildings are in place. And as we mentioned, it's the maintenance portion of the P3 contract that places the restrictions on how the public can utilize these purportedly public buildings. So I just want to stay on this question of how these contracts influence the operation of these buildings and the people who work in them. Because I think what you'll find is a model that not only fails public interest, but also often fails to live up to its own purported standards and benefits. So in 2020, we interviewed workers at P3 institutions across Saskatchewan with the specific intention of finding out how the P3 contract influenced how these institutions operated. Now, obviously, the kinds of sort of sensational restrictions that I mentioned previously is what often gets the lion's shares of media attention. But through talking with workers, we found that the P3 contract influences a lot more of how these buildings function. So I'd just like to briefly discuss what that research discovered, because I think it really undermines the notion of the P3 model as some sort of exemplar of efficiency and innovation. Now, let's recall that one of the purported benefits of the P3 model is it's supposed to capture all these private sector efficiencies. But in reality, if you think about it, a P3 actually adds another layer of bureaucracy onto how these institutions operate. So as part of the provisions of the P3 contract, different parties are responsible for different things, right? For example, here's an excerpt from SNC-Lavalin's user guide for the Saskatchewan Psychiatric Hospital, right? It's supposed to tell staff whom to contact if something needs repairing, if something needs replacing, etc. And according to this, the P3 contractor is supposed to be responsible for the things like plumbing, electrical work, HVAC, etc. Whereas the public sector is responsible for information technology, food services, and cleaning. That seems straightforward. But in practice, it was anything but. Almost every worker we interviewed told us about some conflict they encountered over responsibility, whether between the P3 contractor and the public sector, or between the P3 contractor and their own subcontractors, or between subcontractors and the public sector. Often the public sector worker would be called to service something and then would have to engage in a protracted dispute over whose responsibility it ultimately was to fix this thing. And obviously the P3 contractor has an economic incentive to try and minimize what it's ultimately responsible for fixing and replacing. And you know what we sort of gathered from my interviews, this was just a huge waste of misdirected time and energy for public sector workers. So this is how one worker described one instance. You know, when I go into a school to perform my duties, there's lots of questions as to, well, is it my job? Is it the P3 contractor's job? Nobody really knows. It goes back and forth. Whereas when they go into a public school, they know exactly what they're responsible for, right? So there isn't that constant negotiation. So you've got problems at these P3 buildings that often go unresolved for long periods of time because there's a fight over how best to interpret the contract. One worker told us that some of these fights over responsibility have been ongoing since the building they worked in opened, and the government and contractor continue to try and reach some sort of consensus on how to interpret this contract. Ironically, the P3 model may actually require more bureaucracy and management than the traditional public model, which, you know, of course, the P3 advocates always say is so inefficient. Indeed, despite the advocates of the P3 model regularly touting its efficiency over that of the public sector, we found numerous instances of wildly inefficient practices that were the direct result of the provisions of the P3 contract. Because the contract will assign different duties and responsibilities to different parties, you get absurdities like this, right? So this is, we were interviewing some janitorial staff at a P3 school, and they told us that when they were first started, their job was to clean one side of the door, but leave the other side for the P3 contractor. Literally there with cleaning materials, equipment on hand, but because of the strictures of the contract, they can only clean one side of the door, right? Not what you would consider a model of efficiency. And these examples, and there's a lot more in our report, show that despite these being public institutions, P3 buildings operate primarily in the interest of the P3 contractor, at least for the life of the contract, not in the public interest. And the reason I sort of want to emphasize this right out of the gate is that I think the majority of the public believes that a P3 hospital or a P3 school functions and operates exactly the same as a publicly built school or hospital, right? Often the debate around P3s is framed as, well, who should build our public infrastructure? The public sector or the private sector? While this in itself is sort of incorrect, both the public model and the P3 model use private contractors to construct the buildings in question. It also leaves much of the P3 model unexamined. And we can see why it might be useful for governments, to circumscribe the P3 debate solely to the building construction, as much of the public are often less concerned with how a new school is built or a new hospital is built than that it is built. Right? But I think it's hugely important for the public to understand that this isn't just about a building model, right? While they outwardly might look the same, a P3 school or hospital will operate in a fundamentally different manner and under a very different incentive structure than a public school or a public hospital for at least 30 years. Okay, so if the P3 model doesn't serve the public interest, why are politicians so enamored with them? Let's get into the details. So when P3s first start to emerge in the 1990s, they allowed governments to provide infrastructure off the books. P3 payments were not debt, so for politicians who were concerned with appearing fiscally prudent or who had their hands tied by balanced budget legislation, this was a way of providing infrastructure without appearing to be going into debt. Of course, the payments are debt in that they actually have to be paid off, but it just wasn't accounted for that way. Now, with the advent of new accounting standards, P3 projects are now mostly on the books, so that the advantage for politicians is less so. Now it has more to do with pushing debt down the road and stretching out payments over decades, a sort of buy now, pay later approach. And most P3 projects don't require payment until the construction phase is completed. So in the immediate short term, it looks like we're getting something for relatively nothing. And given that the average career of a politician is about 8 years, you know, those politicians that vote for a P3 won't be around when these contracts run their course and you actually get the final bill. And so I think that, I think this is really illustrative of why politicians love P3s, even though they ultimately cost way more in the long run. So this is from the United Kingdom, looking at the long-term difference in cost between a traditional public build model and the P3 model for a group of public schools. Yellow is the public model. And you can see that the public model has an initial higher outlay because that's where they pay for the majority of the construction. So in the short term, it does look more expensive. But over the lifetime of the contract, the P3 model is 40% more expensive, but it takes 15 years before the P3 costs overcome the cost of the public model, right? By the time the costs come due, most politicians are already collecting their pensions. So I think P3s have really proven politically instrumental to allow sort of debt-shy governments to continue to build infrastructure, but push the debt way down the line where, you know, their government won't be responsible for. So let's return to those main arguments again about what the advantages of the P3 model are. So private finance. Now, how could this be a benefit, particularly when private financing is always more expensive than government borrowing? So the reasoning of P3 advocates is that because the consortium has to raise its own capital to finance the project, it has an incentive to ensure on-time completion and penalty-free completion of the project in order to be able to pay back its borrowed money on time, right? It has skin in the game. And I guess that's true to a certain respect, but we have to pay for that skin in the game, right? They're not doing this out of altruism. We have to pay back what they borrow, we have to pay for, right? So we ultimately pay for the skin in the game because the higher interest costs are part of the regular payments that government has to make to the P3 consortium. And just a few points of difference in borrowing rates can have huge consequences for the public purse, right? So this is just, this is the UK National Audit Office, once again, illustrating the difference in total payments on a 30-year loan of £100 million, right? So the government usually borrows in the 2 to 3% range. Private financing can be up to 3 to 4 points higher. That's an awful lot of money to ensure on-time completion. At the higher end, you're practically paying more interest than the actual loan itself. Let's move on to risk transfer. And as I sort of said, this is often held up as the most significant advantage of the P3 model over the traditional build. And this is supposed to be the source of massive savings. So risk transfer, put simply, is the cost of things going wrong, right? Risk transfer is a supposed amount of potential dollars in risk that the government transfers to the private sector for things like cost overruns, construction delays, weather events, inflation, things like that, that might inflate the overall cost of the project where it's solely in public hands, okay? The government pays the private partner a risk premium in exchange for the private partner accepting responsibility for any cost inflation associated with the project. And I think this is important to remember because sometimes politicians like to state the P3 model ensures that the government isn't on the hook for cost overruns, but it's not like it's some freebie, right? The government has to pay a premium to ensure the P3 consortium is ultimately responsible for any fixes or repairs. We are effectively gambling that the cost of the insurance premium is less than what it might cost if things go wrong and the project were solely in public hands. I'd like to just spend a little bit of time on the idea of risk transfer because, as I said, it's really the linchpin of almost any argument as to why the P3 model is supposedly superior. So let's just take a look at how it works. So before a government embarks on any P3 build, they'll inevitably conduct what's called a value for money analysis. Or I should say, one of the big consultancies will perform a value for money analysis, like KPMG or Deloitte. Often a huge conflict of interest, because these companies not only consult on P3 projects, but also actively lobby for them. But anyways, that's an argument for another day. So anyways, they conduct this value for money analysis, which is supposed to be an impartial assessment of which building model they should use, public sector, or the traditional public build, or a P3, right? So a value for money analysis, compares the cost of pursuing a project through a traditional public build model, what's often called the public sector comparator, versus a P3 model. If the cost of the public model is higher than the P3 model, then the difference between these two costs is the potential savings or value for money that can be achieved by pursuing the P3 model. Now, if you look at these value for money assessments, you will notice one very curious thing, and that is the public model is always the cheaper option at the outset. Not some of the time or most of the time, it is always the cheapest option at the outset. So let me give you an example here. This is the Regina wastewater treatment plant. As you can see, the base cost of the public model is cheaper, but then you'll notice a few extra costs are added. Here, the significant number is retained risk, which is about $61 million, which once added, all of a sudden the public model becomes more expensive than the P3. Just to show that this isn't an isolated example, here's the value for money assessment from the Saskatchewan Psychiatric Hospital. About $50 million cheaper until you add in the retained risk of $176 million, and voila, the P3 is now $80 million cheaper. Just to show you this isn't unique to Saskatchewan, here's the Chief Peguis Trail in Winnipeg, once again, right? Base cost of the public model, lower, add in risk retained, all of a sudden P3 becomes cheaper. Sometimes they'll do this in bar graph. This is the Regina bypass. Once again, public build $100 million cheaper until you add the risk in. And I've read VFM assessments from all over the country, and the public build model is always cheaper until the risk is added in. And you would expect it to be, right? We're not using private financing. You don't have all the transaction costs of the P3. You're not funding profits for 30 years. Of course it would be cheaper. So without the retained risk, the cost rationale for P3s pretty much falls apart. It's the only reason P3s can claim to be more cost effective. So given how important risk is to the P3 model, they must have a very rigorous process of calculating how to reach this dollar amount, right? What kind of price should we put on risk? How do they come up with this specific cash figure? It must be a very, very rigorous process. So let's take a look at how the risk was calculated for the Regina wastewater plant. This is from Deloitte & Touche, their value for money report for the city of Regina. So as you can see there, this is the risk estimates. You got that? Here's a bit more. A bit more. Can you see all that? Are you sufficiently enlightened? Of course, I'm being cheeky. There's nothing there, and that's because it's all been redacted, right? How the P3 consulting firms come up with their risk quantifications is a proprietary secret and can't be revealed to the public, even though they're being paid with taxpayer dollars. There's no universal accounting standard or established methodology for monetizing risk, and we have no idea how the consulting firms come up with their numbers. We just know that they have the curious property of always making the P3 option less expensive than the public option. Now, there have been occasions where we have been able to see inside the black box of how these risks are monetized. And that's when provincial auditors have been granted access to these estimates. And unfortunately, they leave a lot to be desired. So this is the Ontario auditor. Another concern we had was the $67 million in transferred risks that was added to the design and build estimate. This amount was arrived at on the basis of the judgment and experience of management and consultants. Owing to the subjective nature of the estimates, it is virtually impossible to substantiate the validity and accuracy of the quantified amounts. The Ontario auditor believed that the value for money assessment was overestimated by $634 million. This is the New Brunswick auditor. We did not find evidence that the department compared the total amount of quantified risk with actual experience from prior school construction projects to assess their reasonableness. They believed the risk allocation was overestimated by 14 million. This is Alberta. We did not find evidence that estimated risk costs were in total validated against experience from prior school construction projects. They believed it was overstated by approximately 20 million. This is our own here in Saskatchewan provincial auditor. We found that participants and experts made decisions about identified risks, calculation of related costs based primarily on the results of verbal discussions, not making information available in writing or maintaining empirical data makes it difficult to substantiate and scrutinize decisions. And that's just a small selection from a long list of provincial auditors that have been highly critical of the quantification of risk used in these DFM reports. From what we can gather, the consultants, who almost always have a financial interest in the P3 model, essentially get into a room with government officials and they blue sky all possible risks, attach a dollar value to it until the public model is more expensive than the P3 model. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it other than how Wayne described it. It's a rigged process. Faced with this evidence, it's hard for me not to agree with the United Kingdom's National Audit Office's Jeremy Coleman, who called the value for money risk calculations utter rubbish and pseudoscientific mumbo jumbo. And yet every government will justify its decision to pursue a P3 based on these extremely flimsy value for money assessments. And they almost always find in favor of the P3 model. Last year, we evaluated all the publicly available VFM assessments in Western Canada, and 98% of them recommended the P3 model. This is supposed to be an impartial test. We could find only one VFM assessment that counseled in favor of a public build, and that was because only one private contractor bidded on it. If the value for money assessment is an impartial measurement, shouldn't the recommendation rate be substantially less than almost 100%? So be very, very critical when governments lean on these assessments to justify a P3 build. So just to wrap up, you may have noticed that I cite a lot of numbers from the United Kingdom, and there's a reason for that. The United Kingdom has been a pioneer in P3s. They call it the Private Finance Initiative, but it's pretty much the same thing. And they've used it to build an enormous amount of their public infrastructure over the last 30, 40 years. The United Kingdom gives us a very clear view of what happens when these P3 debts start coming due 30 years after the fact, and it's not pretty. In the UK, they call it a PFI time bomb. There are currently over 700 P3 deals with a capital value of around $60 billion. And the United Kingdom government owes about $200 billion. So for $60 billion worth of assets, they owe $200 billion in debt. I don't know if that's a fair deal. What did they get in return for this debt? They must have received top of the line, high quality infrastructure for all this money, right? Not really. They got crumbling schools. This is a wall collapse at a primary school in Scotland that ended up forcing 88 other P3 schools in Scotland to close for repairs after being judged unsafe. And I think that's another aspect of the P3 contract that doesn't get enough attention. As I mentioned, private financing and the so-called built-in penalties for delays are supposed to act as incentives to ensure on-time completion. But what if they actually act as an incentive to deliver rushed and incomplete buildings? Because that's certainly what it seems to be the case. Certainly that's what it seems to be the case with the Saskatchewan Psychiatric Hospital, which was from the workers that we interviewed, believed it was opened in a far from completed state to avoid the penalties of late completion. And it's important to note that this feeling was shared by other workers. They told us of what are called deficiency lists, which are lists of unresolved repairs. They're supposed to be resolved prior to opening, and virtually to a person, they said these were never resolved, often resulting in brand new buildings requiring tons of maintenance after the fact. So I think it's important to ask, when governments tout the ability of P3s to open on time, whether this is a goal worth achieving if it means buildings that can't safely accommodate the public it's supposed to serve. So to conclude, P3 advocates love to say that they have learned from their mistakes, that whatever disaster befell some other P3 project won't happen here because we've learned from those mistakes. As I mentioned, the United Kingdom has had the longest experience with the P3 model, has had many mistakes. It's learned from them. And after its 30-year experiment with P3s, the UK has perhaps learned its final lesson on P3s, which is they banned them. They will not use them anymore because, according to the Treasury of the United Kingdom, it was inflexible, overly complex, and a source of significant fiscal risk for government. My biggest fear is that we are essentially following the UK example, and that by the time the public realizes the threat of the P3 model, the damage will not only be done, but we will be effectively locked into the paying for that damage for years to come. So let me leave it there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks might have.